Something was off the moment I pulled into the parking garage and saw my assistant's car already gone at 7:43 in the morning. Tessa was never early. In 11 years of working together, the woman had never once beaten me to the office. She was the kind of person who showed up at exactly 8001, coffee in hand, already 3 emails deep on her phone. So when I saw that empty space where her silver Accord always sat, my stomach dropped before my brain had time to explain why. I sat in my car for a moment, just sat there with the engine running. 22 years. That's how long I had been with Meridian Health Systems. I started as a regional compliance officer out of our Charlotte office when the company had maybe 400 employees and a handful of outpatient clinics scattered across the Carolinas. By the time I walked into that parking garage on a Thursday morning in October, Meridian had grown into one of the largest regional hospital networks in the Southeast, with over 11,000 employees, contracts with 3 major federal agencies, and a stock price that had tripled in the past 6 years. I had helped build that. Not alone, not by any stretch, but I had been there for every merger, every regulatory audit, every moment when the whole thing could have come apart. My title was Executive Vice President of Compliance and Risk Management. My team had kept Meridian clean through 4 separate CMS audits, 2 Department of Justice inquiries that went nowhere because we had documentation for everything, and a period in 2019 when half the hospital systems in the country were getting hammered for billing irregularities. We never got touched. I was 51 years old, and I was 6 weeks away from the single largest financial event of my life. The parking garage detail probably sounds small, but when you've spent 2 decades learning to read institutional signals, you start to notice when something is missing that should be there. You start to notice the quality of silence. I took the elevator to the 14th floor. The receptionist, a young woman named Britt who had been with us maybe 8 months, looked up when I came through the glass doors and then immediately looked back down at her keyboard. Not a good morning. Not the little wave she usually gave me, just a very deliberate study of her screen. I walked past her toward my office. My assistant wasn't at her desk. Her monitor was off. Her chair was pushed in perfectly, which it never was. There was no coffee cup, no yellow legal pad covered in her handwriting, none of the small signs of the person who had just stepped away for a moment. It looked like no one had been there at all. I set my bag down, sat in my chair, and looked out at the Charlotte skyline for about 30 seconds. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up my calendar. There was a meeting block I hadn't put there. 9 a.m. Conference Room B. Attendees, myself, the Chief Human Resources Officer, and the CEO. No title, no agenda notes. I looked at that blank calendar entry for a long time. Then I opened my bottom desk drawer and took out a folder I'd put there 18 months earlier. I didn't open it. I already knew what was in it. I just set it on the desk in front of me, smoothed my hand over the cover, and thought about the conversation I'd had with my attorney when we drafted the language inside. "You sure you want this clause?" he'd asked me. His name was Whitmore, and he had been doing executive employment law in North Carolina for 30 years. He had seen everything. Most companies will push back hard. They didn't push back, I told him. They signed it. Then you're either very lucky or very smart, he said. I hadn't felt particularly lucky that day. I had felt careful. Let me back up. In 2021, Meridian went through what the board called a strategic leadership transition. What it actually was, the founding CEO retired, a private equity group took a significant minority stake, and a new chief executive came in from a large hospital network in Ohio. His name was Hargrove. Mid-50s, trim, the kind of man who said things like value optimization in casual conversation and seemed to mean it. I watched what happened to the executive team over the next 18 months. 3 people who had been with Meridian for over a decade were gone within a year of Hargrove's arrival. 2 took early retirement packages that were, from what I heard, quietly coerced. 1 was pushed out over a manufactured performance dispute. All 3 were over 50. All 3 were at the top of their salary bands. I'm not a suspicious person by nature, or I wasn't. 22 years of compliance work had made me methodical, not paranoid, but I was watching a pattern form, and I had enough experience with institutional behavior to know that patterns don't form by accident. So I did something that at the time felt almost embarrassing in its deliberateness. When my contract came up for renewal in early 2022, I asked for a clause. It wasn't complicated. The language was precise. If Meridian terminated my employment within 90 days of a major compensation event, defined as any bonus or equity vesting exceeding $500,000 without documented cause directly related to performance or conduct, the company owed me twice the value of that compensation event, plus consequential damages. The company's general counsel read it, flagged it to Hargrove, and Hargrove apparently shrugged and said to sign it. I heard later, secondhand, that he'd said something like, "We're not planning to fire him, so it doesn't matter." That's the thing about people who are planning something. They often don't know it yet. My compensation structure at Meridian included a long-term incentive plan that had been building since 2019. It was tied to a set of compliance and risk benchmarks that my team had hit every single year. The vesting date was November 19th. The amount that would vest, $2.8 million. Not a bonus in the traditional sense. It was deferred compensation, built up over years, tied to performance I had already delivered. The $2.8 million wasn't a reward for future work. It was payment for work I had already done. Hargrove's team knew this. They had access to every compensation schedule in the company. I have thought many times since about the decision they made. I have tried to understand the logic. My best reconstruction is this. They had been planning to restructure the compliance function for a while, probably folding it under the CFO's office and bringing in someone younger at a lower salary point. The timing was, I think, intended to save the company the $2.8 million by terminating me just before the vesting date. They had probably run the numbers. Even accounting for a generous severance, they figured they'd come out ahead. What they had not done was read my contract carefully. At 9 a.m. on that Thursday morning in October, I walked into conference room B. My HR chief, a man I had worked alongside for 7 years, could not look at me directly. He kept his eyes on the folder in front of him. I felt something close to pity for him, which I had not expected. Hargrove was at the head of the table. He had 2 people with him I didn't recognize. One was clearly an HR consultant of some kind, and the other was a young attorney from outside counsel. That detail struck me. He'd brought outside counsel to a termination meeting. "Thanks for coming in," Hargrove said. "Of course," I said. I sat down. He talked for about 4 minutes. Restructuring, strategic realignment. The compliance function was being integrated into a new risk and finance structure. My role was being eliminated. It was nothing personal, nothing to do with performance. The company valued my contributions. There was a severance package prepared. He slid a folder across the table. I didn't open it. "What's the effective date?" I asked. "Today," he said. I nodded slowly. "And the board approved this restructuring when?" A pause. "The restructuring plan was finalized last week. And the documentation on that decision, the board minutes, the org chart changes, the position elimination records, those are all filed?" The outside attorney looked up from his notepad for the first time. "They will be," Hargrove said. "Will be," I repeated, "not are." He didn't answer. I pulled the severance folder toward me and opened it. It was a clean package. 14 months of base salary, continuation of benefits through the end of the year, a non-disparagement clause, and a release of all claims. Standard for my level. Almost generous, actually, if you didn't know what I knew. "I'll need to have my attorney review this before I sign anything," I said. "Of course," Hargrove said. He seemed to relax slightly. "Completely standard." "There's one other thing," I said. I reached into the folder I had brought with me, the one from my desk drawer, and slid a single page across the table. "Section 8.4 of my employment agreement," I said. "I'd recommend your counsel take a look." The outside attorney picked it up. He read it. He read it again. Then he turned to the HR consultant and said something I couldn't hear. The consultant leaned over and read it. She sat back in her chair. "Give me a minute," the attorney said to Hargrove. "What is it?" Hargrove asked. The attorney handed it to him without speaking. I watched Hargrove's face as he read. It didn't go white the way people describe in stories. It went very still, which I found more interesting. "When does the incentive plan vest?" the attorney asked me quietly. "November 19th, I said. 6 weeks from today." The room was quiet for a moment. "And today is within the 90-day window," the attorney said. It wasn't really a question. "October 8th to November 19th is 42 days, I said. "Yes." Hargrove set the page down. He looked at me for the first time since I'd walked in. Really looked at me. I think it was the first time in 2 years that he had actually seen me as something other than a line item. "We'll need to pause," he said. "Of course," I said. "I'll be in my office." I stood up, picked up my folder, and walked out. I want to be honest about what the next 3 weeks were like, because the stories you hear about situations like this always skip the middle part. They jump from the dramatic room scene to the triumphant outcome, and they leave out the stretch in between where you sit in your home office at midnight reading case law. You only half understand, waiting for emails that don't come, running numbers on your phone at 2 a.m. because you can't sleep. My wife was extraordinary, I want to say that clearly. We had been married for 26 years, and she had seen me through every difficult season of my career. The years when Meridian was struggling, the periods when I'd worked weekends for months at a stretch, the times when I had to make calls that nobody wanted to make. She didn't panic when I told her what had happened. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, listened to the whole thing, and said, "What do you need from me right now?" What I needed was for Whitmore to work fast. He did. Within 48 hours of the termination meeting, he had sent Meridian's general counsel a formal notice citing Section 8.4 and stating our calculation of the obligation, twice $2.8 million, equaling $5.6 million, plus consequential damages to be determined. He also noted, calmly and without theatrics, that the termination appeared to have occurred without the documented cause required to exempt Meridian from the clause, and that the board minutes Hargrove had referenced did not yet exist at the time of my termination. That last part was important. Whitmore had done his research. Meridian's outside counsel responded 4 days later. They argued, essentially, that the restructuring was a legitimate business decision, that the timing was coincidental, and that the clause as written was ambiguous in its application to position eliminations as opposed to performance-based terminations. Whitmore sent back a 12-page response. I read every word of it. I don't have a legal background, but 22 years of compliance work means I can read a contract argument. His position was airtight. The clause made no distinction between termination types. If I was terminated within 90 days of a qualifying compensation event without documented cause related to my personal conduct or performance, the obligation triggered. Full stop. He also attached a note about the timing of the board documentation. The minutes from the restructuring decision had been filed 4 days after my termination. Whitmore flagged this as potentially relevant to questions of good faith. The calls between attorneys went on for 2 weeks. During that time, I heard through a former colleague who was still inside that the company was in something close to a controlled panic. The general counsel had apparently told Hargrove that the clause was, unfortunately, unambiguous, and that fighting it in court would cost more than settling it, and would come with discovery risks that nobody wanted. There were federal contracts in play. There was a Department of Health and Human Services audit scheduled for the following spring. The last thing Meridian needed was its former EVP of compliance, sitting in a deposition, describing the circumstances of his termination. On November 3rd, 16 days after the termination meeting, Whitmore called me. "They want to settle," he said. "What are they offering?" He told me. The number was $6.1 million. The calculation, $5.6 million per the clause, plus $500,000 in consequential damages covering documented losses, COBRA costs, retirement account disruption, the value of unvested equity that had been forfeited outside the clause's scope. There was a confidentiality provision, which Whitmore had negotiated to allow me to discuss the general facts of my departure without disclosing the specific settlement terms. There was also a provision I had asked Whitmore to request, a written acknowledgement that my separation from Meridian was not for cause and was not related to my performance or professional conduct. I wanted that on paper, not for vanity, because in the compliance and risk management world, reputation is currency, and I intended to keep working. I signed the settlement on November 7th. My daughter called me that evening. She had known something was happening, but not the specifics, and I told her everything. There was a long silence on the phone. "Dad," she finally said, "you put that clause in your contract 18 months ago?" 20 months, I said. "Because you saw this coming." "I saw the possibility," I said. "I didn't know it would happen. I just knew that if it did happen, I wanted to be standing on solid ground." She laughed a little. "You're either very lucky or very smart," she said. I had heard that before. The thing is, I don't tell this story to celebrate the money. $6 million is life-changing, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But what I actually think about when I sit with this whole experience is something simpler. I spent 22 years doing compliance work. My job at its core was this: understand the rules, document everything, and make sure that when something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong, you are standing on ground you can prove. That's not paranoia. That's just how institutions work. The gap between people who get buried by institutional decisions and people who survive them is almost never talent or loyalty. It's almost always documentation. My wife said something to me the week after everything settled that I keep coming back to. We were sitting on the back porch on a Saturday afternoon, and she said, "You know what I keep thinking? You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't scheme or plan anything underhanded. You just read your own contract. You knew what it said. That's all." She's right. That's all it was. Hargrove, from what I've heard, is still at Meridian. The restructuring happened. My old department was folded into the CFO's office, which I had predicted. The person they brought in to replace me, a woman in her mid-30s with about 8 years of experience, is apparently competent and working hard, and I genuinely wish her well. She didn't do anything to me. What I do know is that Meridian's federal contract renewal with the Department of Veterans Affairs went sideways about 4 months after I left. I don't know the details, and I'm not going to speculate. I will say that 22 years of compliance work doesn't just walk out the door without consequence, and some things that look like cost-cutting decisions turn out to be exactly the kind of decisions you can't afford to make. My attorney called me when he saw the news about the VA contract. "You see that?" he said. I saw it. "Coincidence?" he asked. "Probably," I said. "Or probably not. Either way, not my problem anymore. I'm consulting now, independently. Smaller clients, more interesting problems, no parking garage to watch in the morning. My wife and I are talking about moving closer to where our daughter lives, which has been a conversation we've been putting off for years because I was always too embedded in Charlotte to think about leaving." The clause that everyone called overly cautious, the one my attorney raised an eyebrow at, the one that Hargrove apparently dismissed as a non-issue because he wasn't planning to fire me, that clause is the reason I'm having this conversation instead of fighting a lawsuit with my own money. 22 years of compliance work taught me one thing above everything else. Read the contract, read it again, and if there's language you care about, make sure it's in there before you sign. The fine print is the only print that matters when everything falls apart. I keep coming back to the moment I sat in my car in that parking garage, engine still running, staring at Tessa's empty space. Nothing had happened yet, no one had said a word to me, but something in my gut already knew, and the question I had to answer in those 30 seconds was the same question I'd been answering my entire career. Am I standing on ground I can prove? That's the part people don't talk about, not the settlement number. Not the moment Hargrove's face went still when he read Section 8.4. What actually protected me that morning was a decision I had made 20 months earlier, on an ordinary afternoon, when nothing bad was happening yet. That's when integrity does its real work, not in the crisis, but in the quiet before it. I've thought a lot about what the word integrity actually means in practice, because I think most people define it too narrowly. They think it means not lying, not cheating, keeping your word. And yes, it means all of that. But in the context of a career, of a working life that spans decades, integrity also means being honest enough with yourself to see what's actually happening around you, even when seeing it clearly is uncomfortable. I watched 3 colleagues get pushed out in 18 months, and I let myself know what I was watching. I didn't explain it away. That honesty, that willingness to face an uncomfortable truth, is what made everything else possible. The clause itself, that came from something different, from years of learning that institutions don't protect people out of loyalty, they protect themselves. Understanding that isn't cynicism, it's clarity, and clarity, applied carefully, is the sharpest tool I know. I had spent 22 years building systems designed to anticipate what could go wrong before it did. It would have been almost embarrassing not to apply that same thinking to my own situation. The smartest thing I did wasn't negotiating hard in those settlement calls. It was doing thinking early, when the stakes felt low and the outcome felt theoretical. But here's what I want to be clear about. None of it would have mattered without the middle part. The 3 weeks between that conference room and the settlement call. The nights my wife found me at the kitchen table at midnight. The moments when I genuinely didn't know how this would land. When the other side was pushing back and Whitmore was saying, "We have a strong position," in that careful attorney way that means nothing is guaranteed. Holding steady through that stretch. Not catastrophizing, not capitulating, not letting the uncertainty collapse my judgment. That required something that has no legal name. Call it steadiness. Call it the refusal to fold when the pressure is real. My daughter said I was lucky. I told her luck is what happens when you've already done the work. She laughed. She's probably right that it's both. What I know is this. The outcome of my situation was decided long before October 8th. It was decided the day I sat across from Whitmore and said, "I want this clause in the agreement." It was decided every time I documented something carefully, when it would have been easier not to. It was decided by who I had been for 2 decades, not by who I was in that conference room. The fine print protects you, but only if you were paying attention long before you needed it to.